Thank y'all for coming out. Thank you to everyone online. Bittersweet. This is the last one. But, to quote Ed, his word, not mine, we're going to hearken back to everything that we have covered in the last 5 weeks. Very excited about this. So this is where we bring it all together. We're going to look at, we've taken the last 5 weeks to look at chapters 1 through 11 and part of chapter 12 of Genesis, kind of individually and in their microstructures. Today we're going to bring everything back together that we've studied over the past 5 weeks and try and sum it up as best as possible. So before we get started, a little housekeeping from last week. Last week I was talking about Abram at Bethel, and I said that Bethel was the house of bread. That is very incorrect. Bethel is the house of God. So big difference. Saying Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, yes, I was thinking that, and then just said house of bread instead of house of God. So 1 week late, 1 week overdue, but here it is. So if you go back and you watch through it, so I made a mistake last week, and here it is. But now let's move into the actual summary of everything that we've covered. We started 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, I guess now, with the goal of navigating the opening pages of the Bible in the same way that the original audience would have. And so we spent that time exploring the themes, the imagery, etc., from the Bible and trying to do it from a biblical worldview of the time in which the Bible was written. This was somewhat of the blueprint we followed. We sought to ask what questions were the original writers trying to answer. In other words, what questions were the original audience, the people living at that time, asking, and how was the text originally written within the design pattern of it. Because we had two thesis statements running through these past 6 weeks. One of those was how the biblical authors organized what they were saying was just as important as what they were saying. So the how and the what are directly tied together. In other words, the organization goes hand in hand with the meaning. And then the second thesis statement was really that Genesis 1 through 11, these chapters that we've covered, are the foundation, really kind of the textbook to the images, the vocab, the terminology, design patterns, etc., for themes and images, etc., that you will see throughout the rest of the Bible. So establishing them here in their context, what they meant when you see them show up later, which we're going to dive into that tonight, we'll be able to understand the message that is trying to be conveyed to us. And then the slide that we've seen every week, I don't care if you're tired of it, I love it, so we're going to keep using it, is really this Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, which is that picture on the top, we've used as an illustration of ancient thought, kind of the ancient mindset of the writers and the audience. It's not a quote-unquote accurate portrayal of the night sky, if you will, in terms of, like the bottom picture where it's a telescope view. From the James Webb Telescope, there's patterns designed into it, and there's colors, and you can see kind of the weaving and out and how the lights are highlighted. And that's kind of, we use that analogy because the biblical writers and the biblical audience, they had a different way of reading and writing and composing, and obviously it was all done under inspiration. But we talked about what can happen when we merge views together, and we do it. I'm not saying we do it intentionally. I'm saying I'm right there with you. We all grow up now. We grow up now. We're obviously not from then, and so it's hard. Whether or not we know it, we often just take our worldview and read it into the Bible without thinking about it. And when we do that, you can see that picture on the right, you lose that details from the original, specifically kind of in that, in the Starry Night setting. And so we spent the last 6 weeks, we're trying to get back to here. We're trying to get back to that original picture. And the way that we've approached and done that is by examining the text very closely. We've examined original wording, we've examined design patterns, etc. And some of the terminology, we'll just kind of jump right into it now, that we looked at the very beginning. We're gonna follow the images and the patterns that we've covered, and then we're gonna connect everything together. But if you remember in week 1, we talked about this right here, the very first word of the Bible in Hebrew, Bereshit. We talked about how its literal meaning is in beginning. On how there is no the or definite article there. In week, I believe, 4, we looked at how both the Greek Old Testament as well as the New Testament, which was written in Greek, have that same beginning in Greek, just in beginning. And we talked about what this can mean in terms of translation. And then we made a really big leap and went to the second word of the Bible and got to the Hebrew word bara, and we kind of looked at one of the issues of today, this you might have heard the term creation ex nihilo, which just means creation from nothing. And it's often taught, actually, that bara means to create out of nothing. And it's used as a proof text there in Genesis 1:2 that this is the time when God did the creation out of nothing. But we looked at other biblical passages with that word bara, which you see highlighted in green. This is from Isaiah 45:18. And we looked and compared it with other verbs, or other words, such as formed and made, the Hebrew words yotzer and asa, which are used interchangeably with that in places and do not exclusively mean creation out of nothing. So where we concluded with that was that bara is something unique to Yahweh, but it does not necessarily mean creation out of nothing. And so that is one of those things that we can ask a question, a modern question, hey, where did when was that point in time, or where did, the creation from nothing come to, and try and read it into that passage. And we just see that it doesn't, if we want to keep the Bible consistent with the wording that it has, looking in, with the wording that it uses, we trace it down and we just kind of put it to the test and see if it works. And then we also looked, this is still in verse 1, we looked at the words that are often translated as heavens and earth. In Hebrew, shamayim and eretz, which literally to the ancient audience would have just meant land and skies more literally. And then we looked at several scholars that had quoted on it, but I like Tim Mackey's from the Bible Project. I think he put it, just summarized it the best, that the Hebrew word eretz, which is that word earth or land that we see translated, does not mean globe earth. That is a modern meaning of the English word earth that depends on a concept of the planet as a sphere, which was not available to the biblical authors at that time. A much more appropriate English word for translating eretz would be land. And again, I'm saying all this please understand that there is discussion and debate around this too. So I'm not up here trying to state absolutes. I understand that there's that there's discussion about how it should be translated. But we were looking at, possibilities. I mean, the theme was, or the title of the whole 6 weeks was Rereading Genesis. But we looked at that possibility of both skies and land. And then we jumped into really kind of the pre-creative state within Genesis 1, verse 2, of how the land or the earth was without form and void. It was tohu vabohu in Hebrew. And that we talked about how this was an ancient way to think of nothingness. How we think of nothingness as the absence of space, time, and matter. This is essentially what they're getting, or what they mean by nothingness, or at least one of the meanings, and that non-existence to them meant no purpose and no order, which we saw in Jeremiah 4:23, which is the next slide. And these terms, they played into kind of this Genesis 1, creation narrative. But to look at that, Jeremiah 4:23, this is when Jeremiah, he's speaking, he says, I looked out on the land, or the eretz, or the earth, and behold, it was without form and void. It was tohu vabohu. And to the shamayim, the skies, the same words from Genesis 1, and they had no light. So we can see here that land is in existence. He's looking out on it, but it is without form, that same tohu vabohu. It has no purpose. It's uninhabited, in other words. And it has no light, which is that creative act in verse 3. And so we kind of see, letting the Bible define the Bible, we come across these terms and we see, we have to ask the question, am I reading it through a modern mindset, or am I reading it through those ancient eyes? And then along with that tohu vabohu, we looked at and darkness was over the face of the deep, that this was another way to describe that non-reality that preceded creation. So kind of it's a double. It's, hey, the earth was without form and void, and just in case you were wondering, it was darkness, there was darkness over the face of the deep. So really just reiterating the fact that right now there's no purpose at all, and that's a setup for what God is about to do, the main character of the Bible. And also that the darkness and deep are two of the most iconic images of disorder, chaos, and death in the biblical imagination. So I say biblical imagination, or really the mind of the ancient person. And then we talked about how the word deep, the Hebrew word tahom, was a dark, chaotic ocean, or chaotic and terrifying waters. We looked at kind of some of the polemic play from other surrounding religions of that time period, from Mesopotamia, from Ugarit and Babylon, etc. And then I don't think we discussed this, but we kind of see, if you want to think to Jesus when he walks on the water, or when he calms the raging storm, there's this idea that Jesus is doing exactly what God did all throughout the Bible, and here obviously in Genesis chapter 1. We also talked about how this idea of the deep, it shows up again. It shows up in the story of the flood in Noah's Ark, where there was God created in Genesis 1. He creates out of that chaos and disorder. He brings order to that. And then because of the rebellion of humanity, he brings the chaotic waters back on to the earth. And so we see this decreation act, and that's kind of part of that narrative where you have a creative act, you have a decreative act, and then you have a lot of subsequent events that kind of mirror each other in the middle. And then kind of to get back of the days, and Heather, you and I were talking about this beforehand, we talked about how the days of creation in the Genesis 1 account reflect each other, how they're written in what's called a linear style, where days 1 and day 4 correlate, where days 2 and day 5 correlate, and where days 3 and day 6 correlate. And there's also other design patterns within, but this is this is one of the ones we focused on early on, and how kind of days 1, 4, 2, and 5 focused on the sky, kind of that sky realm, and sky or water, if you will. And then days 3 and 6 focused on the land and the land's inhabitants. So yes, forward symmetry is what it's called, was that literary style. And then there was also that, we talked about chiastic structure, that kind of mirroring one another. It's written within this too. So it's beautifully intertwined. So which, inspiration. But I digress on that. And we talked about the term light. So God said, let there be light, and there was light. We saw this in Genesis 1:3. This word light is going to be very important throughout the entire Bible, even on into the New Testament. We looked at how God said, let there be light, and it was so. So there was this idea that God essentially says something or thinks something, or he says it, and then he acts upon that, like, let there be, and then he creates, which also had, kind of some polemic play when we looked at other religions as well, specifically within Egyptian religion. They had gods that couldn't do both. So they had to have a pair to kind of work together. So there's some play going on there as well. And then Genesis 1:4 talks about how God separated the light from the darkness, which is a huge theme throughout the entire rest of the Bible. When we look at places like 2 Corinthians 6:14, where it said, or what fellowship has light with darkness? And then in John 1, chapters 4 and 5, when John's writing about Jesus, he says, in him, Jesus was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So just as God, back in Genesis, overcame the darkness by shining, it's not the sun. The sun's not created till day 4, so that's something that happens on day 1. It's God's light penetrating through the darkness and establishing order. And John's making, clear that Jesus does the same thing here, that light shines and the darkness does not overcome. And we also looked at how, correlating with day 1, with the light, we saw on day 4, God makes the sun, the moon, and the stars. He makes the sun the greater of the lights, which some translations actually say lamps, which I think is kind of cool. He made the 2 lights or the lamps. The word literally means a luminary. But the greater to rule the day and the lesser to rule the night. So you kind of have this ruler aspect. I'm not saying they're physical like deities or anything like that, but it's just this kind of, hey, they're up in the sky, and you get humans that actually rule kind of on land. Different Hebrew words, but kind of same concept going on. And then in direct with it, with the moon, or with the sun and the moon and the stars, this is something we've covered how many times? Jeremy's preached on several times. But how there's signs and seasons. The moon is for signs and seasons. That's actually what Psalm 104, verse 19 says. He, being God, made the moon to mark the appointed times. So right here we see these appointed times, that Hebrew word moedim, which literally means the appointed times or festivals. It's a setup for the future, that as you read this in Genesis, you're anticipating and looking for these appointed times, these moedim, to come up later in the story. And ultimately, we get to see them in the New Testament as well, where the Messiah becomes the very embodiment of these days. So from the beginning, God, through the writers, through the inspiration process, is letting them know, hey, write this in at the beginning, because these days, these appointed times are going to show up time and time again. And they're going to be the actual sign, the picture, the embodiment, or the Messiah is going to be the embodiment. They are going to be the signs of him. So I'm hoping that this is kind of painting kind of that thread, that red thread, if you will, of Jesus running through in these other themes as well that you'll see throughout the whole Bible, why it's so crucial to start a book. And I'm criticizing myself here, because I used to just pick up the Bible and read it at any given place. And I was like, I don't do this with any other book. I don't pick up like a trilogy and start in the middle somewhere. Like, even, we get in the New Testament, John, in the beginning, and so it's kind of like, hey, in the beginning, go back, if you want to know the fullness of what I'm about to tell you. But on to day 2, days 2 and day 5, how they correlate. We looked at the separation of the waters, how God said, let there be an expanse, and he separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And we talked a little bit, again, this is an issue that people will debate back and forth, but we just talked about how one of the interpretations is really there's this biblical cosmology that fits really well with ancient cosmology rather than with our own current understanding of how the cosmos works, just because they didn't have telescopes and whatnot back then, but that God is still communicating a message that he's creator. And so we have kind of, and that's what that picture right there illustrates. And so when we see God, he essentially separates the sky realm from the water realm, if you will, on day 2. And then on day 5, he actually makes inhabitants. So where there was disorder, he made order. And where there was no inhabitants, he made inhabitants. So you've got the birds and it's actually in Hebrew, it's kind of, the swarming, the fish swarmers or the water swarmers, and kind of the flyers. So you kind of get this ones that are in the water and ones that are flying on the face of the sky. And then again, just kind of rehash what we talked about. We looked a little bit how that ancient cosmology model was very similar throughout all ancient Near Eastern cultures. And so this idea that perhaps God is meeting people in the worldview that they come from, where they are. Just like he meets you and I where we are, he doesn't meet us where he expects us to be. He meets us where we are, and that God still can still communicate, the truth of who he is through that. So we looked at that possibility as well. And then we looked at some scriptures too that would kind of, letting the Bible kind of define itself and letting the Bible essentially, just kind of be what it is. We looked at verses like Psalm 29, verse 10, which says, the Lord sits enthroned over the flood. It says the flood came when God released the waters of the deep, it came from above and below. So God is sitting kind of on those flood waters that he's containing that are above. And then the Lord sits enthroned as king forever. And what I love about this, Psalm 29 is actually viewed as kind of one of the earliest Psalms, maybe the earliest. I think it's one of the earliest. I don't think they can quite date it to which one is the earliest, but certainly this is one of the earliest that there was. And then you get passages in Isaiah 66 that the Lord says, heaven is my throne and the earth is kind of my footstool. So again, he's kind of sitting over that throne. And then in Proverbs 8, and there's more than just this, but these are just a couple examples talking about when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, and when he assigned the sea its limits. That's kind of the boundary of the land. And then one thing I thought that was very interesting that it was Tim Mackey again who made this comment, and I'm sure he made it with others, but he says this, that the Hebrew Bible is replete with descriptions of creation as a tabernacle which God has pitched. So kind of this cosmic tabernacle or temple, if you will. And then we looked at days 3 and day 6, how those correlate. And really the big connection that we made there was that on days 3 and day 6, there's a bonus act of creation each day. So on days 1 and 4, 2 and 5, there's just kind of one creative act per day. Day 3, you get a bonus. And the bonus correlation was that there were fruit trees. There was seed. Seed, that became a big theme that we'll talk about here in a minute. But fruit trees bearing fruit. And then there were humans. And so we got this connection between humans and trees from the very beginning. It's kind of, the hint, hey, remember when you see trees later on, remember when you see people later on, because there's this theme that trees are to associate human and trees, and to also that trees were a place of testing or where God met people. If you see, God met Abram, or where he meets him in chapter 12, we looked at, he met him in an oak tree, or at the oak trees, plural. And then, we saw humans kind of being trees. The book of Proverbs calls Lady Wisdom and the righteous trees of life. And then the blind man that Jesus healed, the first thing he says to him is, he says, I see people, but they look like trees. And so you get this idea of like, well, why is it? That's kind of a weird comment to make. But if we're catching this correlation back in Genesis, it makes sense. And then Jesus, obviously, the vine and the branches. You just preached on that this past Sunday too, and this was in here before that. So thank you, Lord. And then the cross also as a tree. He was hung on a tree, and so again, the tree of life being a place of testing, or just trees in general. Adam and Eve at the fall. They were at the tree. They fell at the tree of knowledge of good and bad. And then Moses at the burning bush. I know it's a bush, but hey, it's kind of, you get this tree-like imagery. It still has seed that it comes from. And there's plenty of other examples too throughout the Bible. And then we talked about that idea too of, the gaining knowledge, specifically, the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, how it was, we looked at the theme of knowing good and bad was a sign of maturity. And these are just three of the many verses, again, from Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and 1 Kings that really talk about how it's, not knowing good and bad or good from bad is something that a child has to learn. And so there's this idea of Adam and Eve tried to, and they were deceived, obviously, we know that from the story, but they tried to gain knowledge on their own terms. And they tried to seek it and do it without the instruction of God, and ultimately that's where we get the fall. That happened within the garden, and speaking of gardens, that was a major theme that we talked about too. We talked about how garden imagery was the language of heaven and earth in the time of the biblical authors, of the biblical audience, etc. It even talks about in Ezekiel 28 how Eden is the garden of God, and it's actually also called the holy mountain of God. And then we talked a little bit too about how kings would take the trees of conquered kings and they would plant them in their own garden. So it's kind of like your trophy room, like the ancient trophy room. Like, hey, look at everybody I've conquered over here. Here's all the trees. And then really that, I had to throw this slide in there. I just had to do it. But we looked at that, this is Eden right here in this middle where heaven and earth meet. That is Eden. That is paradise. And we also looked at, in relation to Eden, how Noah, we talked about God on the seventh day resting, and how resting can really be associated when we look at, Exodus, the Sabbath commandment, and resting uses a different word than in Genesis, but it kind of ties together two meanings about how resting is taking up residence. And that you have a person who God chooses, when he chooses to decreate everything, he's going to raise up a high priest who was found to be righteous, and that turns out to be Noah, whose name is Rest. And he puts him on this little floating garden with all of the Eden imagery that floats upon the waters of the deep and then comes to rest on a mountain. So you have this idea of the holy mountain of God, kind of the garden resting on a mountain. And then God restores the Edenic covenant with him. Where we see this theme repeat throughout the Bible, or one of the places that we do, I should say, is the story of Moses. So the word translated as ark in Genesis, I believe it occurs 25 times throughout the Bible. 23 of those are in Genesis. The only other two are describing the basket that Moses was placed in on the Nile River. So you have this story of Moses, you have this little baby, eventually this priest-like figure that ultimately it says that Jesus, the Messiah, will be one like him. But you have him placed in an ark on these chaotic waters, and ultimately he's drawn out again. And so you see this theme repeating itself throughout the Bible. And then all the way to Revelation. All the way to Revelation. I know, Jeremy, you had these slides in a couple weeks too, or these verses. Revelation 22, 1 through 5, talks about heaven as kind of this Eden 2.0, this Eden as it was always intended to be, if you will. I mean, we have the river of water, we have the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit. You have the night will be no more, so night, no more darkness, no more chaos, and there will be no need of light, of lamp or sun, because the Lord will be their light. So that same light we see from Genesis 1, the Lord's light that penetrates the darkness, it's going to be there as well. That's what's going to be the light in the new heaven. And then ultimately we saw, I shouldn't say ultimately because Revelation I guess would be ultimately, but we looked at this garden imagery in the story of the cross as well, how the criminal who's hanging on the cross, one of them says, ask Jesus to remember him. And Jesus responds by saying, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. And we looked at that word paradise in the Greek is paradisio, which is actually translated as garden. So today you will be with me in the garden. You're going to be with me in Eden today. It's all about to be better. And then we also looked at, this imagery, like within the garden, within the fall, we looked at the theme of seed. And how the punishment for the fall in terms of, the serpent or the divine being, we kind of looked at the possibility of both, how the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman will always be warring together with each other. And this was the indication to us that the biblical author giving us the cue that, hey, you need to pay attention to the genealogies that are about to come up, because there's going to be a war of seeds, if you will, the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And ultimately the penalty for the fall, the first fall in Genesis 3, was that Adam and Eve were removed from the garden. They were banished from the garden, and we looked at how Eden was really kind of this, or the temple and tabernacle portrayed an image of Eden as well, and how when you move from the Holy of Holies outward, you're actually walking in an east direction from the tabernacle and temple, and how Adam and Eve were banished east of the garden. So this same type pattern, you can see a lot of the same type imagery. You've got the cherubim, etc. And we don't have time to go into every single, little detail and like the bronze laver and the bronze altar, but there's some in-depth stuff there as well. But anyways, that theme of moving east, we saw the same thing happen to Cain. When he kills his brother, they're already outside of the garden, but he's removed even further east. God casts him away. After he kills his brother, he has to move east. And we ultimately see, I don't think I have the slide for it in here, but we saw at the Tower of Babel how all the people migrated east to the land of Shinar, where Babylon was, who was associated with a really bad guy, and then who ultimately founded Nineveh. And so you get this theme of moving east, moving kind of further away. And then within the Cain and Abel story, obviously Cain murdered his brother Abel, but God provided a new seed, kind of this idea that Cain chose to be of the serpent, if you will, because of the crime that he committed. And so God, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. Seth kind of is a play on the word anointed in Hebrew. They're a word play with each other. For she said, God has appointed for me another seed. And it's at this time that people began to call upon the name of the Lord again. And this was a direct, we got a hint of who Abram was or who he was going to be, because it says, same wording in Hebrew, that at Bethel, east of Bethel, which is the house of God, he built an altar to the Lord there, to Yahweh, and there he called upon the name of the Lord. So basically we got Abel. People began to call on the name of the Lord. Then a bunch of bad things happened until we eventually got to Abram, kind of tracing that seed. That's where all those genealogies kind of came in, really those chapters 4 through 11, until we had someone call upon the name of the Lord again. And ultimately, Abram passed through the land, where he was going, to the oak of Morah. And so we have this, there's another tree right here, but the key theme from this was that Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, to your seed I will give this land. So we see this theme of the seed, the seed of the woman, inheriting the land that God has chosen. And again, we see this kind of from Adam and Eve, at the time of the fall, they were the original royal priests. That's something that's been taught here several times. And then Abram, soon to become Abraham, and his wife Sarah, we kind of see them as those new priestly figures. Obviously, there was Noah in there as well, but there were some issues there as well. But this was the purpose of all the genealogies, was to show that seed, the seed of the woman, is ultimately going to be that priestly line. And this theme of genealogies, while it might seem just kind of, I'm just reading a big list of names, this can't be important at all. 2 of the 4 gospel writers thought it was important enough to, one, start off the book of Matthew with the genealogy of Jesus, and then Luke in chapter 3 to do the genealogy of Jesus as well. So they're showing you that, hey, genealogies are important, and we're getting that from drawing back on Genesis. And what's interesting in this Matthew genealogy, this is kind of a fun fact because it said that the Messiah would come from David, that you get this 3 sets of 14 generations in the book of Matthew, kind of leading up to Jesus. And it's kind of, okay, why 14? There's obviously people being intentionally left out if you go and trace it back through other genealogies. But the word 14 is the numerical value of David. And so you kind of had this David theme going on. We talked about numbers too, which we'll cover more in a little bit. But we kind of just went through as many, symbols, images, etc., that we possibly could in the 6 weeks. And we really, honestly, we just scratched the surface of it. So we've got to reread Genesis again and again and again. And then along with, kind of these images and these themes and these writing styles, we also looked at some things that were a little bit, uncomfortable or difficult to kind of reconcile with, that really kind of challenged us, that stretched us out a little bit. And I won't go through all of them, but kind of some of the main ones that we looked at was kind of how we look at the account of Genesis 2 within our Bible. Is it a separate account? Do you have Genesis 1 being kind of God creating his cosmic temple, and then there's a transition to God making, humanity, Adam and ultimately Eve through him, and bringing them into a garden? Is it 2 separate accounts? Or kind of the more popularized and well-known one is that it's just a recap, or more, not a recap, but more detail added into day 6 of creation. And so we kind of looked at, the differentiating views there. We also looked at support and how really you see that transition right here, how it uses that. We looked at the generations formula that occurs 10 times in Genesis. It's always talking about something moving forward rather than back. And so we kind of looked at, what are they really getting at here? Are we asking questions and imposing kind of our questions to be answered on the Bible, or are we just reading it as intended to be read? We also looked, and we didn't spend too much time in it, but this concept that, yes, God is a perfect God, and he can create perfectly, but when he said it was very good, he did not use the word perfect. And there's this idea, we kind of explored what baseline we explored of it. Again, it's not that God can't create something perfectly. That is not what I'm saying at all. And I'm saying this is up, people debate this as well. We brought it to light. But if something was perfect, there would be no need for Adam and Eve to rule over and to, even to tend the garden, if you will. If everything was perfect, they could just do as is. And so we looked at kind of that theme, exploring it, from that standpoint of what does very good mean. And then also kind of, Cain, what are you talking about when you said whoever finds me will kill me? Because kind of, a traditional understanding is that Adam and Eve being the first people, and there was Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother. Cain goes off and he knows his wife. She conceives and has a son, and he's worried about people finding him and killing him. So what's going on here? We explored kind of the various views on, Adam and Eve being the first people, or a literary symbolic view. We kind of went through all of them. I won't rehash them again, but basically when it came down to it, were Adam and Eve the first people, or were they the first high priest among humanity? Because we looked at that word in Genesis 1 where it says God created man, which is really humanity, and kind of explored the possibility, is that God creating humanity and then him selecting 2 individuals and placing them in his sacred garden space to be the priests, to kind of bring, be fruitful and multiply doesn't just mean procreate. It's kind of the theme we were going with there. It means bring people into the family, just like the Great Commission is kind of, can be seen as this be fruitful and multiply as well. We also looked at the concept of original sin, in regard to Adam, and the 2 views that, hey, there's this idea that original sin means that you and I and all people are guilty and inherit the sin of Adam, and are thus from the time of conception, essentially we're guilty and we are sinners. And we looked at kind of, the man who popularized, Augustine of Hippo was the one who really kind of popularized this way back when, and it stuck. And we talked about how there's some translational, maybe some translational discrepancies in there, which I did actually hear back from my buddy who was a Greek major in college, a biblical Greek major, and he reached out to one of his professors about this, and his professor gave us a lengthy kind of discussion about it, that basically where he went on it was that it was, the text that he was using, it was the Latin Vulgate, which didn't match the Greek, and that's kind of why you have this Greek, and again, that was just like his research. I'm not saying that as a grounded fact. I'm just saying we talked about the differences of it, and how kind of you have, the West, kind of Roman Catholicism down to Protestantism, et cetera, accepting in large part this original sin view, to whereas Greek Orthodox does not, because they say, we have the original Greek text and it doesn't say what the Latin Vulgate says. So we looked at that. And it's just something to kind of think about as we reread and, we reread Genesis and continue to explore the Bible. And then kind of the last, one of the last things we looked at in terms of kind of these difficulties was, had to do with the genealogies and had to do with the ages and the years of the people. It's, very high by any standard. You have people, Methuselah living to be 969 years old. And we talked about how in the ancient world, numbers, again, talked about 40 was a big one that you had discussed when you came up here, but how numbers can have more than just a literal meaning. And so when you look at someone like Lamech, for example, who lived 777 years, kind of this play on the Lamech who was of Cain's line, who bragged about murdering and said, I will get vengeance 70 times 7. And then you have this other Lamech who has, 7's the number of completeness or perfection. You have, hey, he lived 777 years. And then we compared this line, that was the line of Seth, or Adam through Seth, I should say. That's kind of the seed of the woman, as opposed to Cain, again, being the seed of the serpent because of what he did to his brother. And we contrasted several of these people, and we saw similarities between many of them. We also compared this list to the Sumerian king list, which, neighboring, rivaling religious system as well. And we kind of looked at, is there a play going on here? Because we talked about the Sumerian king list. Obviously, the ages are much higher. You get all the way up to 72,000 in that list, but how these were all based on the number 60 in some way, shape, or form, because 60 was their ideal number. And we saw how the Bible, potentially the Bible played on this system as well, because all of these ages in some way, shape, or form are, given within multiples of 60. And if anybody's interested, there's a really good article that a very good scholar who took a lot of math nerd time to go and calculate all this out. But one of the things we looked at, just one comparison, was Enoch. The two seventh people on the list right here, Enoch and however you pronounce that other person's name. They both kind of walked with God, or the other guy walked with his God, if you will, and ultimately the main deity in his place of worship. These are all kings, so his city, the main form of worship was the sun deity. So they worshiped him. Then you have Enoch being 365 years old, kind of this idea. And so there's kind of thought bounced around that, hey, is this just a play kind of on one complete solar year cycle? Because Enoch was taken up. He never saw death. He was taken up after this. So there's thought behind this, and there's been much discussion around, going past just a literal age count with these numbers. We looked at a lot more numbers than just those numbers, but, kind of, again, we explored some of the numbers we saw, like even the ark. The volume of the ark was expressed in kind of comparison to, the number 60 as well. But we looked at, to go back all the way to Genesis 1, we looked at the number 7. I'm just going to kind of go through a list of numbers here about how 7 communicates completeness. That we saw words that were repeated in multiples of 7 times throughout Genesis. God, land, skies, and dome. That dome being the same as the expanse. And there were specific words that get repeated 7 times, some of them in specific, kind of micro sections of their own. And this phrase that God saw that it was good, that word good being used 7 times. So there's this idea of completeness wrapped in, and, there's 7 days of creation, in the Genesis 1 account. And how this correlates to the creation account in Genesis 1. Some would view it as, kind of a cosmic temple. And we see this theme of 7, 7 days that open with the divine command and God said, correlating with the tabernacle design and the Sabbath from Exodus, where there were 7 speeches that open with the divine command. And then along with that, and a little bit later in Exodus, with the completion of the tabernacle, there's 7 acts of obedience to those 7 divine commands. And then with the completion of the temple in Jerusalem, there were 7 petitions of Solomon upon the completeness of the temple. So you get this idea of 7, completeness. And you have this linkage between the, kind of the cosmic creation, if you will, God's cosmic tabernacle, if that's a view you choose to look at it through, all the way to the actual tabernacle and the physical temple as well. And then we get to occurrences of 7 in the New Testament. So this is one of those themes that carries on. 7 is of great importance. There are 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John. One of those being, I am the light of the world. Kind of that same light that we talked about from Genesis. It's that light that penetrates the chaotic darkness. It doesn't just mean, hey, I'm going to flicker on the lights. This is conquering the chaos, if you will, and the disorder. There's also the I am the true vine, which kind of talked about going back to that seed reference. So you have this idea of, seed, generations, etc., attaching ourselves, bearing fruit, that kind of deal. And then we talked about it just a minute ago, but 10 times God said in Genesis chapter 1. You have these 7 divine commands to creation, let there be, and then there's 3 divine initiatives towards humanity. So a total of 10 times that God's, and God said something. And we looked at how the number 10, this correlates to the same number of plagues that were in Egypt. It's the same number of times that God will speak to institute the sacrificial offerings in Leviticus. And it's also the number of commandments given, the 10 commandments that are given. And so there's this idea of 10 as well. And then a little bit more on just kind of 7, we saw it in the flood narrative. There's 2 periods of 7 days of waiting. And then 40, you talked extensively about 40, how 40 is another way of saying complete. And so we looked at 40 days of the flood, down to, Jesus ascending, Jesus ascending, after 40 days on earth. Jesus also spent 40 days in the wilderness. Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days at least 2 different times, and the Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years. And so kind of looking at this, are these literal 40? Are they kind of just going on the metaphor, or are they both together? And they certainly could be. We also looked at the number 70. There's 70 nations that are listed in Genesis chapter 10. 70 is another number that signifies completeness. And so there's this idea of a complete, these are the sons of Noah, completeness, a complete world, if you will, that's been inhabited through them. And even I was reading I can't remember who I was reading, but they said there were way more than 70 known places, at the time. But what they're doing is it's not necessarily, and this is the opinion of this person, so take that. I'm not sharing my own opinion up here. I just thought it was an interesting read. But what they were getting at is that there's more than 70 actual cities, if you will, but these 70 nations are chosen specifically to signify the completeness, of the world. That it's really just this portrayal of completeness, even though there's more cities. These are the main places, and these are the descendants of Noah. And so there's this idea that, 70, cool. We're using that as completeness, and we see Jacob going to Egypt too. In Exodus chapter 1, it says all the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, or 70 people. I don't know why the ESV translated it that way. I'm sure it's right grammatically in English. But we have this idea of 70 again. So this idea of completeness. There's a complete family coming. And even same thing here, I was reading, there's more descendants than 70 of Jacob. But it talks about specifically those that came directly through him, directly through Jacob, because there can be people associated with. But these are kind of people that are indirect. He has 12 sons and kind of going that. And then it says Joseph was already in Egypt. So right there that he's at least got 71, but it's saying 70. The completeness of Jacob is coming to Egypt. And then in the New Testament, Jesus sends out 70 disciples. And so it's not just, a random number that Jesus is just, hey, you 70, go. It's kind of, no, there's great purpose and intent behind Jesus sending out these 70 ahead of him. And he's telling them, hey, wherever you go, eat what's set before you, heal the sick, and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. So I'm sending out Jesus is sending out a complete number, and he is instructing them to say that the kingdom of God has come near. And so where I wanted to kind of transition from here, that's kind of the numbers, and certainly we looked at more details than that, but within the numbers, but a good kind of overview is this idea of the how and the what correlating together. So how the biblical authors organized what they're saying is just as important as what they're saying. And kind of just the best example I could think of, because this is something I used to wonder about all the time, like, way back in the day kind of growing up, is we tend to ask questions when we're reading accounts, or at least I would, or I've heard the discussions I'm sure we all had. We read the flood account, and it's kind of, oh, hey, were there dinosaurs on the ark? And if there were, based on the specifications of what the ark's given, where would they have to sit so that they didn't sink the ship, or so they didn't overweight it to one side? It's kind of the questions that used to bounce around in my mind. We've heard discussions around, etc. But again, I think when we ask these questions, we're asking something that the Bible's not trying to answer. The biblical authors design through inspiration, they design the text in a specific way to convey a specific message. And so this is kind of where we look at the grand overview of all 11 chapters. So this is chapter 1 right here. This is the kind of the outline of how it goes. It starts out, you've got a summary, like a prologue summary. Then you have an exposition. And you have the first verse of the Bible that we looked at. It's 7 words, very strategically, 7 words. Verse 2 is 2 lines of 7 words. And then this correlates to the very end, where you have 3 sets of 7 words. So you see this sets of 7 theme. And then it wraps up. You have the word create at the very beginning right here. And then you wrap it up with everything that God created, which God created to make. And then in between, you get the days that we looked at in the correlating linear structure, or the linear forward symmetry of the structure pattern as well. And then when you get into chapter 2, starting at 2:4, where we saw that transition, going all the way, the next section actually extends all the way to chapter 3, verse 24. Some will stop it right here. We kind of talked about how kind of the oldest known manuscript doesn't stop right there. It goes to verse 24. And what that shows is where we stop it in our Bibles, verse 21. And that is where the humans are banished from the garden. However, verse 24 ends with God making skin, garments out of skin for Adam and Eve. So it ends with an act of grace rather than an act of banishment and punishment. And so, but, looking at this structure, it encompasses really, and I know it's kind of hard to read, but you have humanity is created and placed in the garden all the way up into humanity being banished from the garden. And you can see how this kind of the correlating colors kind of go towards the middle. The very central theme of this is when they actually take and eat from that tree. And so you have this grand buildup of man and woman. They're created, they're unified, and then there's dialogue that happens, and then the fall occurs, and then from there, everything just all the good that happened gets reversed on with bad. And then starting in chapter 4, kind of the grand summary there, this is where we saw the generations kick in. We saw it started with, Cain murdering Abel and Seth coming on the scene. You got the 3 sons of Adam right there. And that with Seth, people began to call upon the name of the Lord again. And then we have to go through all these other generations. We go through the flood, the Tower of Babel, until eventually in Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abram out of the nations, and this is when Abram calls upon the name of the Lord. So we had to go through all of this right here, all these genealogies, these 2 really bad events that occurred because of 2 falls, until once again the Lord's name is called upon. And then here's the big one. Here's the one we've been waiting all 6 weeks for. This is a grand kind of summary structure of all 11 chapters right here. You can see that there's the great creation narrative, that's that top in blue, that Genesis 1 creation. That correlates directly with here. That's the flood. That's the decreation narrative, all the way down here to where Abram is brought up as the new humanity, the new high priest. And so it's a fresh restart. That be fruitful and multiply is reinstated there, as it was after the flood too. And then you can see all of these correlating events, kind of in between. These red and these yellows will line together, but you have, I don't know if you can see, but B1 right here, you kind of have, that's where you have that garden scene, the nakedness of Adam and Eve. They didn't know shame. Then when they ate the fruit, they realized they were naked and shame came upon them. That correlates to Noah, that sinful act that we discussed last week about how Noah planted a vineyard, kind of this garden theme, and that a sexual sin occurred because of Noah's nakedness as well. And so all of this, you can see, it correlates together, from the generations being 7 and 10, up top, to them being 7 and 10 down below, to various acts such as brothers dividing, etc. And so this is really, it's a good summary of how you can piece together these first 11 chapters, really chapter 12, the first 9 verses of it. But you can see a pattern occurring here, so that ultimately you are able to see kind of, where is the writer and where is ultimately the Lord pointing us in the direction of what does he want us to know that's important, not what are we trying to come to the text with and have answered for ourselves. And so we're almost to the end. Again, we talked about this at the very beginning, and what I really hope this past 6 weeks has done is I hope it has given us a start to where, rather than combining these worldviews that we have, kind of the ancient and modern view being meshed, and that how we read the Bible in regard to these first 11 chapters, that we've been able to peel back some of that modern thinking that is just imposed on the Bible. And ultimately, we get back to this picture so that we can see and understand and have the knowledge of the truth and the fullness, not just the truth, but the fullness of the truth of the message that God wants us to communicate. And it's a daily journey as we go through this. And this is why, titled it Rereading Genesis, because my hope, my prayer is that we'll all go back and we'll reread Genesis, and then we'll reread it again until we pick up on these images, these themes, these design patterns, so that as we move forward throughout the rest of the Bible is that things are going to start clicking and making more sense when you see words like light and all the other images and scenery that are not scenery, but images and themes that we've covered along. And you'll start recognizing design patterns too. Like, hey, I recognize kind of, there's 2 outlying themes, 2 similar themes right here, and then it builds up to a middle point right here as well. And so where I want to leave it tonight is back at the beginning where we started. Because ultimately, we've looked at how important how we choose to look at a passage can be. This was in relation to Genesis Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 from one of the commentaries and translations that I had mentioned in week 1. And it talked about how we choose to translate really verse 1, but verses 1 through 3 at the end of the day on how I've highlighted the quote here because a lot of times, I think this is true for how we can all interpret or choose to interpret the Bible, is that the choice depends on translation philosophy. In other words, am I coming to the Bible with a theology that I have formed that I'm going to read into the text, or am I going to let the Bible define its own theology? And so, again, we kind of saw this was just the commentary on that, but we looked at this at the very beginning, and the reason that I am ending here is because it starts with the very first word. How we choose to translate, or how we choose to look at the Bible. Is it in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, or is it when God began to create? And again, it's a journey that we're all on together, but one of the main takeaways, maybe the main takeaway I personally took from this that was shown to me, was that starting from that very first word in Hebrew, that Bereshit, if it's translated, if I choose to look at it in the beginning, or if I choose to look at it when God began to create. And either way that I do it, I can still impose kind of my own modern worldview on it. But there's this idea of taking the approach, trying to really dig in deep to what the original audience, what the original authors, how they would have originally read this. This right here, this one verse and this one word, I truly believe, and I've seen in my own life, just reflecting on it, how the interpretation of this will set you on, a path. Really, there's two paths that kind of deviate from here. There's obvious crossover in between, but this is the very start. It starts in the very beginning, and that's why we are ending at the very beginning. And so, again, the hope and prayer is that we'll continue this journey together. And Jeremy, I want to say thank you to you, and yeah, you can come on up, and to the church, Alan, everyone who's allowed me to come up here and share these past 6 weeks. It's been a blessing for me. I've truly enjoyed it, and I cannot wait to reread Genesis with you all again, maybe soon in the future.
No, thank you, Brad. Yeah, thank you. These last 6 weeks were absolutely phenomenal. Yeah. I just wanted to share some closing thoughts of some of this stuff. Brad's teaching tonight was very time appropriate because it was kind of like July 4th. It was like pop, 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 pop. We have that coming on. So much good stuff in here. But when he said tying it all together, there's some parts that he said tonight that I want you to focus on. He said the whole gospel, Brad said at the very beginning, that the whole gospel can be tied up in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And so you're thinking to yourself, how can that be? Well, let's think of two things. Well, number one, I love how he said, you got to think when people started reading this, they didn't start reading this in Genesis 1, so to speak, right? So they were reading this much later. Jubilees makes mention, that's a whole other topic that Brad and I were talking about that we chose to stay away from. But there's a whole other, when was it written? Jubilees says that the Torah was written when he went up on the mountain for 40 days. There's different types of opinions there. But, you have that audience of people that were in the desert. Some even say it was finished during the time of Babylon. The Torah was finally put together during the Babylon exile. So anyways, the readers that were reading this, it's really important to look at it through that lens. For example, when he talked about that one slide that we show all the time about the appointed times, when they were reading this, they weren't like, oh, the Lord put the stars and the moon in the sky for us to understand summer, winter, fall, spring. That was not their thought, because the word was appointed times. It wasn't seasons, right? So as you're reading this, you're like, oh, so the Lord at the very beginning put these things in the sky so we could understand the feasts that you want us to celebrate. As Christians, we now read it and look back and say, oh, from the very beginning, God put things in the sky for us to understand who Jesus is from the very beginning, right? So it's all, like you said, it's all the way you read it. The other thing is like when he said, let there be light, and there was light. And then the prophets start prophesying this theme of light, prophesying that the light of the Lord will come breaking in. And then here comes Jesus in John 1, light shone in the darkness, and the darkness could not comprehend it. It was this whole theme of light that kept on coming through that started from Genesis and talking about chiastic structures. What was the first thing? Well, I keep on pointing up there. What was the first thing God created? If you look at the syntax view, it wasn't the heavens and the earth. What was the first thing he created? Light, right? Which makes even more sense. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is the one way to look at it. Or you can look at it, like I love it, when God began to create, he said, let there be light as the first thing. So you want to talk about chiastic structure, starting at one point and ending at one point. How does it end in Revelation? It ends with John writing, so I need to pull it up. This is how it ends in 22. And there'll no longer be any night, nor will they have need for the light of a lamp or the light of a sun, because the Lord God shall illuminate them, and he shall reign forever. So it goes all the way from let there be light, the very first creation, and it ends in that very first creative mode. And when you were saying that, I'm like, oh my goodness. Like, talk about the ultimate, like the Bible is an ultimate chiastic structure. From one point to the second point, it has a different meaning. And the last thing I wanted to share, which was just interesting, that Brad was talking about the East. If we wrap this all up, it keeps on getting, pushed back further and further and further and further east. Well, in the prophetic picture that Ezekiel gets of the river, the river of life leaving the temple, we all know that it goes to the east. But what's the ultimate plan of God? To call back those that are dead to sin, right? And so in Ezekiel, the water from the temple, it says this, and the water was flowing from underneath the threshold of the house towards the east, for the house faced the east. And the water was flowing down under from the right side of the house, from the south of the altar, and it kept on going. But what's its ultimate mission? It comes down and it says this, these waters will go to the eastern region and go down to Arabah, then go towards the sea, being made to flow into the sea, and the waters of the sea will become fresh, or the waters of the sea will become healed. And it will come about that every living creature that swarms in every place where the river goes will live. And it keeps on going on, and the others will become fresh. Anywhere that this water goes, whatever touches it will live, right? Anyone that came to Jesus will live, will be brought from death back into light. And so this whole thing in the theme is like, it's all there, but it's just like, how far do you really want to go at it? We can be satisfied with the lunch special, you're right, or, which I'm never satisfied with it because you realize it's going to be a smaller portion than the supper anyways. Right? But or you can be like, no, I don't want the lunch special. I want the dinner special. Give me the 2 pieces of chicken, not one, because I want to go deeper, right? And that's really what it is. And I think that's what really opened up my eyes. But I was just so amazed by all this tonight. So thank you, Brad. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.